Among the intellectually dishonest, a certain railway debate keeps cropping up. United Kingdom's locomotives versus the United States locomotives. This argument is too stupid to even consider taking seriously, but what it does bring along are comparisons between British and American icons of steam. Which to me is even dumber because that's like comparing a thoroughbred Arabian to a Belgian draft in most cases. American steam trains, both in Britain and the continent, were very rare indeed. But for Britain, there were a few standouts. In 1872, the Midland Railway began showing an interest in the American Pullman Company, particularly in operating their own Pullman trains. 2 years later, Midland Railway Pullman trains were a fact. Pullman coaches, or cars if you prefer your Americanisms, were the upperest of crust, the creamiest of the the best coaches one could find. They were particularly known for their comfortable seating. On the interiors of his passenger cars, Pullman, well, if he didn't go to town, he went to the whole state. At first, the Midland leased their cars from the Pullman Company, and there were two types: the parlour car and the sleeping car. Parlour cars were very much how we imagine a first-class passenger car to look, with the sleepers being ostensibly dining vehicles which could be converted into sleeping compartments, with bunks suspended from the ceiling. I suppose it's a right shame that there was only a dining car without a kitchen car to go with it, but hey, sometimes rich folks like themselves a Greg's tuna mayonnaise too. Curiously enough, the travelling public didn't take to the parlour cars, so when the Midland bought the carriages outright, they rebuilt them into what they call picnic saloons. Meanwhile, just before the turn of the century, the Midland was struggling to move their immense amount of freight traffic. The Midland was, up until the 1920s, perhaps England's most national railway company, with lines from Bournemouth all the way to Carlisle, some parts of their network going deep into the territories of other railways. The MR's own works at Derby was full to capacity, and outside contractors like Robert Stevenson of Newcastle and North British of Glasgow also could not find the spare foundry space. The Great Central and Great Northern Railways also found themselves in a similar situation. A strike didn't help matters, so the three of them turned to America, where the Baldwin and Schenectady works answered their call. The locomotives delivered, when constructed from their kits of parts sent by the builders, were small 260 tender engines known as moguls. The 20 delivered to the Great Northern Railway were classified H1, and the Great Central's 20 were classified as Class 15. On the Midland Railway, they distinguished the Baldwin-built examples as the 2501 class, whereas the Schenectady locos were the 2511s. The first ones entered service in 1899. The Baldwin locomotives were just more or less American locomotives, and that was all there was to them, minimal alterations made to make them compatible with the rolling stock and loading gauge of the UK. Meanwhile, the Schenectady locos were more familiar to Brits in terms of design cues. They had no support struts linking smokebox and running blade. They had a curved running blade and rigid six-wheel tenders as opposed to the Baldwin bogie tenders. Despite doing what they were told and being cheap to produce, they had a myriad of downsides and never were all things to all people. Firstly, they tended to be awful bumpy. The Schenectady locos were too wide for the Midland's loading gauge, so their cylinders had to have slab sides, which made an otherwise elegant mogul design very dull looking. Furthermore, they had an appetite, and went through more coal and oil than contemporary freight locomotives. In winter, their enclosed cabs were a godsend, but in summer they became unbearably hot due to 2 feet worth of boiler being inside the cab. Although they probably ought to have, they left very little mark on UK steam design when they were withdrawn by the Midland Railway in 1915, being worn out, non-standard designs. The Great Northern locomotives, meanwhile, were mostly used in the West Riding, Leeds, Keighley, Huddersfield, those sort of places, with a short stint on King's Cross suburban trains where they outperformed larger tank engines. The Great Central shared the other railways' sentiment towards the Yankee moguls, describing them as hogs. The last of both the GN and GC examples vanished in 1915, being the only class of 260 ever run on the GC. The Second World War saw more American engines come to Britain, namely the S160-280 and the S100-060 switcher. Switcher is what Americans call a shunter. The S-160s were never operated by a British railway company as part of their own stock, but the Southern Railway, at the behest of Oliver Bulleid, their chief mechanical engineer, did purchase 13 examples of the S-100, with a 14th member joining when the railways were nationalised in 1948. The trend of cheap remains, as these engines were bought for both economy and practicality this time around. They have a wheelbase just shorter than an austerity tank engine depicted here, making them perfect for working the Southampton docks and the small lines radiating from it. Hitherto, such work was carried out by 040 engines, which were getting quite long in the tooth. I also have a feeling that the comment section would frankly eat me alive if I also didn't mention that the S100s also saw service alongside. After Britt spent such a long time bad-mouthing the qualities of American steam locomotives, God decided to put his prankster cap on. In the late 1990s, most of Britain's homebrew diesel locomotives were swept away when modernising was due. They were replaced by the Class 66, the most ubiquitous freight locomotive in the UK. These locomotives, known as sheds or yin-yings, were built by General Motors by their electromotive division. The 66 is in practice a scaled-down version of the EMD SD40-2. Whilst unpopular with enthusiasts due to their mundaneness, it would be disingenuous to say that the Class 66 did not help the reliability of Britain's freight trains out of the gutter. Seems awful ironic, don't you think? After all, everything's made different.